Hi everyone! Today we are going to talk about one of the most important factors on decreasing your risk for experiencing a severe perineal tear during birth, and that is to avoid an episiotomy. I'm going to share with you what an episiotomy is, how you can avoid it, and other steps you can take to avoid tearing during birth. So an episiotomy is when a provider takes sterile scissors and they make an incision at the opening of the vagina through the perineum to basically increase the delivery space. A vaginal tear is a tear to your perineum, which is the tissue between the opening of your vagina and your rectum. Third and fourth degree tears can range from about 3% to 7%, but in midwifery-led models of care, they range more around 1% to 2%. So let's talk about the most important step you can take to avoid having a third or fourth degree tear, and that is to avoid episiotomy. Episiotomy is a procedure that was popularized in the early 1900s, around 1920, by obstetrician Joseph Daly. Joseph Daly believed that people should not be able to birth vaginally on their own, and he thought that birth was an unnatural event, that a baby's head coming through the pelvic floor was unnatural, and that he would decrease women's suffering by hastening the second stage of labor, or the pushing stage, by cutting them. He also believed that a natural tear was jagged and hard to sew up, and so performing an episiotomy means he would be cutting a clean cut through the tissue, which would allow for an easier heal. And this is actually not true at all. Joseph Daly was also a fucking creep, and he stated in his article that he could restore virginal conditions for women by performing routine episiotomies. He has had such a big impact, unfortunately, on obstetrics throughout the entire world. In fact, episiotomy became so routine and so normalized throughout most of the 1900s that it was so challenging for the culture to start to shift ways, even after significant amounts of research came out proving that episiotomy routinely was harmful. In the late 1980s and early 90s, there was a family doctor in Canada who was questioning why episiotomies were so routine and what their benefits actually were. So he conducted a study where he basically assigned different doctors to either use episiotomy as they normally would, or to do everything they could to hold back performing episiotomies. And for the group that were assigned to hold back episiotomies, he found that those doctors had a really hard time avoiding them. But about 60% were able to avoid episiotomy, and this is what he found. So there's this idea that by performing an episiotomy, you're preventing someone from getting a tear, which doesn't make any sense, but that was their logic. Like, if you cut an episiotomy, then they won't tear. But actually what they found was that performing episiotomies increased the risk for severe tears significantly. And out of all the people who did not have an episiotomy in that study, only one of them had a severe tear. So what we know now is that having an episiotomy increases your risk for a severe perineal tear by 22 times. So let's go over my top 3 tips for avoiding episiotomy. So having a provider that does not use episiotomy routinely is incredibly important. And even here in the US, there are many hospitals and providers who don't use episiotomy hardly at all, but there are some who still do pretty often. The evidence-based episiotomy rate should be about 1%. So that means that maybe in your provider's whole career, they've only performed an episiotomy like a handful of times. So although an episiotomy is considered to be a surgical incision, which means it's kind of a big deal, it's not something that you want to have happen to your body without any awareness or without your consent. It still does happen without consent, and this is known as obstetric abuse. Also, if the majority of the people birthing under their care have an epidural, they might not be used to asking for consent when it comes to doing vaginal exams, breaking someone's water, perineal massage, or episiotomy. But touching anybody during labor and birth, even if they can't feel or see what's going on, or performing any medical procedure, is obstetric abuse. And that is what leads to people experiencing trauma during birth, when things are happening to their body and they don't feel like they have a lot of agency or control. When it comes to tearing, first and second degree tears are not associated with really significant pelvic floor health consequences, though everyone is different. But it's really those third and fourth degree tears that can lead to a lot more consequences in the future. And that is why avoiding episiotomy is so important. The problem is that a lot of care providers are not thinking about your future. They're not thinking about your postpartum recovery, and there is not a lot of follow-up. We have a lot of qualitative and quantitative research, both showing the data on the harm of episiotomy and showing how the experience of someone having an episiotomy and the experience of tearing, how that impacts them long term, and how they often feel abandoned by their care providers and like they didn't get any of the support that they needed. If your provider has a higher episiotomy rate, maybe 5, 10, even 15%, 15% is an alarmingly high rate for episiotomy, and I would do everything I could to avoid that provider. When it comes to providers, you can also consider birthing in the midwifery model of care, because in the midwifery model, not only are episiotomies used much less, but the rate of perineal tears, including significant perineal tears like 3rd and 4th degrees, are incredibly rare. Step 2 is to birth in an alternative position other than your back. When your provider has easy access to your baby and your body during birth, they're more likely to be hands-on, they're more likely to use forceps, vacuum, and episiotomy. Also, your risk for having an emergency cesarean does increase when you're birthing on your back, because when you're lying on your back, there is pressure from the baby in your uterus that is pushing on a blood vessel that runs underneath your uterus. And that can impact the oxygen that goes to you, and that can also impact the oxygen that goes to baby. So this can increase your risk of having a cesarean due to fetal heart tone concerns. So avoiding your back, if at all possible, is one of the best things you can do to help support and protect your perineum during birth and avoid episiotomy. Lying on your side or being in hands and knees is a much better position to be in for birth for so many reasons, especially when it comes to protecting your perineum, and you can be in those positions even with an epidural. Especially with a modified or low dose epidural, it's much easier to be able to be in a position like hands and knees where you're supported with pillows and props. If you're in the hospital, you can move down the bottom part of the hospital bed and put your knees there and lean over the top part of the hospital bed. And my last tip for you is to birth in the water or use a warm compress during birth. Water is an incredible tool when it comes to protecting your perineum because it brings more blood flow and flexibility to that area, which helps your perineum to have more give. This decreases your risk for tearing while also helping to decrease pain. We have plenty of research that shows that both birthing in the water and using a warm compress during the second stage of labor when you're pushing can significantly decrease the experience of pain and can also decrease your risk for episiotomy. Being in the birth tub is one of the best things you can do if you want to really do everything you can to avoid episiotomy, because it is very hard for your provider to access your body when you're in the tub. If you're in a hospital where you can labor in the tub, but you have to get out during the pushing phase, I think that's so unfortunate and it's not evidence-based. And unfortunately, that's just the way that a lot of hospitals are doing things right now. If you choose to get out of the tub, I encourage you to not get on your back. If you're asked to get out of the tub, that may come with a demand or a request to get onto your back. And this, even though it's such a vulnerable time when you're pushing your baby out, it's so important that you still choose to exercise your self-agency and say no thank you and birth in the position that feels best to you. And this is something I encourage you to have conversations with your doula or your birth partner support people with to help protect you from ending up in a situation where you're kind of feeling like you have to be compliant and do what the provider says, even if there's no medical indication that birthing on your back is necessary. The only reason someone would actually have to birth on their back, like birthing on their back is best, is if you actually need forceps or vacuum delivery, or if it genuinely feels like the best position for you. When it comes to using a warm compress, if you don't have access to a birth tub or you don't like the birth tub, you can have a provider or a partner take a stainless steel bowl with warm water and fill it with washcloths and apply that washcloth to your perineum while you're pushing. The washcloth can be applied while you're actively pushing, or it could be applied in between pushing when you're resting, depending on what feels best to you. If you are concerned that your provider is a more intervention heavy person and them having access to your baby and your body is something that makes you feel nervous or unsafe, I invite you not to let them do perineal massage, not to let them do warm compress, not to let them anywhere near your body. Birth in an upright or side-lying position where they can't access your body, and instead have your partner be the person applying the warm compress. Provider hands-off is one of the best tools for decreasing your risk for tears and decreasing your risk for episiotomy. And so even if you use a warm compress, if that still is giving your provider access to your baby in your body, it might be better to skip the warm compress altogether and just not let anyone near your baby or your body. No one has to catch your baby unless you're standing up or in a position where your baby needs to be caught. But if you are low to the ground or right on the bed, the baby can glide out onto that surface, they can glide out into the water, or you could catch your own baby. No one has to do these different maneuvers to pull your baby out. No one has to be protecting your perineum by touching your body when your baby is coming out. The best way for you to decrease the risk of having a severe tear is to push in a position that you feel most comfortable in, is to surround yourself by people who you feel safe with, is to not let your provider, if they are an intervention heavy provider, and most obstetricians are, not let them anywhere near your baby or your body as you're pushing your baby out.